Whispers echoed through courtroom 3B. Everyone in Manhattan's elite circle knew Catherine Harrington as nothing more than a socialite, a beautiful accessory on the arm of tech billionaire Charles Harrington. Society dismissed her. Tabloids mocked her quiet demeanor, reducing her to a stereotype of the pampered elite. Opposing counsel confidently prepared to offer her a pitiful settlement, assuming she would simply take the scraps and fade away. But beneath her calm exterior a devastating storm brewed. She sat at the plaintiff's table, hands folded over a single faded manila envelope. Inside rested a single piece of paper, a heavily redacted document destined to shatter a $4 billion empire. The mahogany-paneled walls of the New York State Supreme Court offered a suffocating kind of grandeur. Judge Patricia Reynolds, a woman whose stern reputation was built on decades of dismantling corporate fraud and bitter divorces, peered over her reading glasses. The air conditioning hummed, a low mechanical drone that did nothing to chill the absolute hostility radiating from the defendant's table. Charles Harrington sat slouched in his custom-tailored Brioni suit, projecting an aura of immense, untouchable boredom. He was the founder and CEO of Omnicorp Solutions, a tech conglomerate that had revolutionized cloud-based neural networks. He was the golden boy of Silicon Valley's East Coast expansion, a man who graced the covers of Time and Forbes with alarming regularity. To his right sat Thomas Carmichael, a partner at one of the city's most ruthless litigation firms. Carmichael was a shark in a silk tie, famous for leaving the spouses of billionaires with nothing but their maiden names and a fraction of the alimony they sought. Across the aisle sat Catherine. She wore an understated navy blue dress, her posture impeccable, her expression unreadable. For 15 years she had been Mrs. Charles Harrington. To the board of directors, she was the woman who organized the charity galas. To the press, she was the elegant host of their Hamptons estate. To Charles, as he had so loudly proclaimed during a deposition 3 weeks prior, she was just a wife. "Not that might, Your Honor," Carmichael began, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone as he stood to deliver his opening statement. "What we have before us is a standard, albeit high net worth, dissolution of marriage. My client, Mr. Harrington, is a man of singular generational genius. He built Omnicorp from a dusty laptop in a studio apartment into a global powerhouse. Mrs. Harrington, conversely, enjoyed the fruits of his relentless labor." Carmichael paced slowly in front of the judge's bench, pausing to let his words sink in. "We are not here to diminish Mrs. Harrington's role as a supportive spouse. She maintained a beautiful home. She hosted lovely dinners. But let us be abundantly clear, the wealth generated by Omnicorp is the sole result of Mr. Harrington's intellectual property, his business acumen, and his tireless work ethic. A rock-solid prenuptial agreement signed by both parties in 2011 dictates a generous severance of $5 million. Mrs. Harrington is now contesting this, seeking half of a $4 billion empire she had zero hand in creating. It is frankly a frivolous grasp at a fortune she does not fundamentally understand. A smattering of murmurs rippled through the gallery, mostly populated by financial journalists and a few bored law clerks. Charles smirked, leaning back to check his platinum Rolex. At the plaintiff's table, Olivia Bennett did not flinch. Olivia was a contrast to Carmichael's theatricality. She was a quiet, methodical attorney who built her cases like a sniper assembling a rifle. She stood up, smoothing her skirt, and approached the podium. "May it please the court," Olivia said, her voice steady and piercing. "Mr. Carmichael is correct about one thing. Charles Harrington did build Omnicorp from a studio apartment. What he conveniently omits is whose apartment that was, whose paycheck kept the lights on, and most importantly, whose intellect solved the foundational coding error that made Omnicorp's neural network viable." Charles scoffed audibly. Judge Reynolds shot him a withering glare, and Carmichael quickly placed a restraining hand on his client's forearm. "This is not a standard dissolution, Your Honor," Olivia continued. "This is a case of systemic, calculated erasure. Over the next few days, we will not merely prove that Catherine Harrington was a supportive spouse. We will prove that she was the architect of the very foundation her husband stands upon. They called her just a wife because it was legally and financially convenient to do so." Olivia returned to her seat. Catherine gave her a nearly imperceptible nod. The battle lines were drawn. The facade was about to be peeled back, layer by agonizing layer. The next 3 days of the trial were a brutal exercise in character assassination. Carmichael's strategy was clear. Paint Catherine as a financially illiterate spendthrift whose only contribution to Omnicorp was choosing the color palette for the corporate headquarters. He called forward a parade of witnesses. The former interior designer for their Manhattan penthouse testified about Catherine's obsession with imported Italian marble. A society columnist recounted Catherine's lavish shopping trips in Paris. Even Charles' chief of staff, a nervous young man named Bradley Foster, was brought to the stand to testify that Catherine was never present at any engineering meetings, board votes, or strategy sessions. "She was lovely," Bradley stuttered under Carmichael's direct examination. "She always made sure the catering for the executive retreats was top-notch. But did she ever contribute to the code?" Carmichael pressed. "Did she ever pitch an investor?" "No, sir. Never." When it was time for Olivia to cross-examine, she didn't attack the witnesses' claims. Instead, she reframed them. "Mr. Foster," Olivia asked gently, "you mentioned the executive retreat in 2018 in Aspen, the one where Omnicorp secured the buyout of Vertex data." "Yes, Mom." "Do you recall Charles Harrington's behavior the night before the final negotiations with the Vertex CEO?" Bradley hesitated, looking toward Charles, who was glaring daggers at him. "Mr. Harrington was under a lot of stress. Isn't it true, Mr. Foster, that Charles Harrington had a massive panic attack, threw his laptop into a fireplace, and locked himself in his bedroom, threatening to cancel the entire acquisition?" Carmichael jumped up. "Objection! Relevance goes to the operational dynamic of the partnership, Your Honor," Olivia shot back. "Overruled. You may answer, Mr. Foster," Judge Reynolds commanded. "Yes," Bradley whispered. "He did. And who spent 6 hours in that room with him?" Olivia pressed. "Who walked out at dawn, handed you a perfectly structured term sheet, and then went downstairs to host a flawless breakfast for the Vertex executives, smoothing over her husband's absence by claiming he was deep in coding meditation?" "Mrs. Harrington did," Bradley admitted, lowering his head. The gallery shifted uncomfortably. Catherine sat perfectly still, her eyes locked on Charles. The smirk had momentarily vanished from his face, replaced by a flash of angry red. But Carmichael was relentless. On the 4th day, he called Catherine to the stand. This was the moment the press had been waiting for. The shark versus the socialite. Mrs. Harrington," Carmichael began, pacing with predatory grace, "who signed a prenuptial agreement on May 14, 2011. Is this your signature?" He projected the document onto the courtroom screens. "It is," Catherine replied. Her voice was soft, yet it carried clearly across the silent room. "You had independent legal counsel review this document, correct?" "I did. And that counsel advised you that should you divorce, you would waive all rights to Mr. Fart, Harrington's company, Omnicorp, taking only a flat sum of $5 million? Yes, sir, you understood the terms. You understood that Omnicorp was his. I understood what the document stated at the time, Mr. Carmichael." Carmichael leaned on the podium, feigning a look of sympathetic confusion. "Then why are we here, Mrs. Harrington? Are you claiming duress? Are you claiming you didn't know what you were signing?" "No," Catherine said smoothly. "I knew exactly what I was signing. But a prenuptial agreement protects assets owned prior to the marriage. It protects the company Charles brought into our union." "Exactly," Carmichael practically shouted in triumph. Omnicorp was founded in 2009, 2 years before the marriage. It is separate property. End of story. Catherine tilted her head, a cold, analytical gleam finally breaking through her composed exterior. I don't dispute that Charles founded Omnicorp in 2009, Mr. Carmichael. What I dispute is the assertion that Omnicorp owns the omni-neural engine. The courtroom went dead silent. The omni-neural engine, the one algorithm, was the beating heart of the company. It was the proprietary tech that made the company worth billions. Without it, Omnicorp was just an empty shell of marketing and servers. Carmichael let out a harsh, dismissive laugh. The one algorithm was patented by Omnicorp in 2012. Mrs. E. Harrington. It is the company's property. Is it? Catherine asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Olivia stood up. No further questions for this witness at this time, Your Honor. I'd like to reserve the right to recall Mrs. Harrington later. Carmichael looked momentarily disoriented, as if a step had vanished from beneath his feet on a dark staircase. He had expected her to cry, to complain about fairness, to attack Charles's infidelities. He had not expected her to challenge the very chain of title of the world's most famous algorithm. The weekend provided a tense intermission. Financial blobs exploded with speculation. Omnicorp's stock took a slight, nervous dip of 3% on Monday morning before the opening bell. When court resumed, the atmosphere had shifted. The boredom was gone, replaced by a crackling electric tension. Olivia Bennett stood carrying the faded manila envelope that had been sitting on the table since day one. Your Honor, at this time the plaintiff calls Arthur Penhaligon to the stand. Charles Harrington physically jolted in his seat. He grabbed Carmichael by the arm, his knuckles turning white. Carmichael quickly whispered to him, trying to calm his client down, but Charles looked as though he had seen a ghost. Arthur Penhaligon was an old man, leaning heavily on a silver-handled cane. He had been an early-stage angel investor in the late 2000s, known for spotting tech unicorns before they had offices. He had quietly retired years ago, fading from the public eye. After he was sworn in, Olivia approached him with a warm smile. Mr. Penhaligon, thank you for being here. Can you tell the court about your relationship with Charles Harrington? I met Charles in 2008, Arthur said, his voice raspy but firm. He was pitching a data compression software. It was terrible, a complete mess. I told him to pack it up and get a job at a bank. A few truckles broke the tension in the room, but you eventually invested $3 million into his company in 2010. What changed? Olivia asked. The pitch changed, Arthur replied. More accurately, the core technology changed. In late 2009, Charles came to my office. He didn't have a pitch deck. He just had a laptop. He ran a simulation of a rudimentary neural network that could optimize data packet routing in real time. It was beautiful. It was elegant. It was the skeleton of what they now call the one algorithm. And based on that, you invest it. Not immediately, Arthur said, shifting his weight. I'm a careful man. I demanded an independent code audit. I wanted to see the architecture. I wanted to meet the team. And did you meet the team? Charles told me he was a solo founder. He said he wrote every line of code himself in his apartment. Did you believe him? Olivia asked. Arthur looked directly at Charles, his expression hardening. I did, until my auditor flagged the bizarre anomaly in the source code. Carmichael shot to his feet. Objection, hearsay regarding what the auditor said. Your Honor, Mr. Penhaligon is testifying to his own state of mind and the actions he took based on the audit, not the truth of the auditor's report, Olivia countered. I'll allow it, but tread carefully, Miss Bennett, Judge Reynolds warned. What did you do after the anomaly was flagged, Mr. Penhaligon? I confronted Charles, Arthur said. The code had a distinct syntax, a rhythm. Programming is like handwriting, Mr. Bennett, not filled, and the core engine, the brilliant part, was written in a completely different handwriting than the clumsy user interface Charles had built. I told him I wouldn't invest a dime until I met the person who actually wrote the engine. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The scratching of the court reporter's machine sounded like a jackhammer. And what did Charles do? He panicked, Arthur said. He begged, then eventually he brought her in. Brought who in? Arthur raised a trembling hand and pointed directly at the plaintiff's table. Her. Catherine. The gallery erupted. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Judge Reynolds slammed her gavel repeatedly. Order. Order in this courtroom or I will clear it immediately. Not still. Answer, mud. Bah. Once the room settled into a breathless hush, Olivia approached the clerk and handed over the manila envelope. Your Honor, I am introducing into evidence Plaintiff's Exhibit 42, a notarized original physical copy of a copyright filing from October 2009, predating the incorporation of Omnicorp. She turned to face the courtroom, holding up a copy of the document. This is the original filing for the foundational architecture of the ON algorithm, registered under the title Project Glasshouse. The sole author and copyright holder listed is Catherine Montgomery, now Catherine Harrington. Carmichael was on his feet, his face purple. Objection. This document was never provided in discovery. This is an ambush, Your Honor. Huh? We demand a recess to examine this forgery. That it is not a forgery, Mr. Carmichael, Olivia said, her voice cutting through the lawyer's bluster, and it was provided in discovery. It was buried in box 412 of the 500 boxes of miscellaneous personal effects your paralegals dumped on my office last month to bury us in paperwork. You simply didn't read it because you assumed, like everyone else, that it was just a wife's grocery lists and party invitations. Judge Reynolds peered at the document the clerk handed her. She adjusted her glasses, reading the text carefully. She looked up, her gaze shifting from the paper to Catherine and then to Charles. Charles was staring at his hands, his jaw clenched so tight it looked ready to fracture. The objection is overruled, Judge Reynolds said quietly. The gravity of the moment was not lost on her. This document is admitted into evidence. Olivia turned back to Arthur Penhaligon. Mr. Penhaligon, when Catherine Harrington explained the code to you in 2009, what was your impression? She was a savant, Arthur said without hesitation. She understood quantum routing principles 5 years before the rest of the industry caught up. But she was painfully shy. She didn't want to be a CEO. She didn't want to manage people or talk to the press. Charles had the bravado. She had the brains. They made a deal right in front of me. What was the deal? She would let him take the credit. She would let him build the company around her engine. In exchange, they would be equal partners in life and in wealth. Arthur sighed, leaning back. It seems Charles forgot the second half of that bargain. Catherine sat perfectly still, but her eyes, once demure and downward cast, were now locked onto Charles with the intensity of a predator that had finally backed its prey into a corner. The facade wasn't just cracking. It had completely shattered, and underneath the ruins of Charles Harrington's manufactured genius stood the true architect of the empire, holding the deed to the kingdom. The 48-hour recess granted by Judge Reynolds did nothing to cool the media firestorm. It merely added oxygen to the inferno. Outside the courthouse, satellite trucks choked Center Street. Omnicorp's stock, previously a juggernaut at the NASDAQ, had been halted by the SEC pending clarification of intellectual property ownership. Inside the courtroom, the suffocating grandeur felt suddenly claustrophobic for the defense. Thomas Carmichael, usually a portrait of bespoke confidence, was visibly sweating. His silk tie was pulled a fraction of an inch loose. Charles Harrington looked as though he had aged a decade over the weekend. The arrogant slouch was gone, replaced by a rigid white-knuckled grip on the edge of the mahogany table. When Judge Reynolds called the court to order, Carmichael immediately launched his counter-offensive. He could no longer deny the existence of the 2009 copyright, so he chose to render it irrelevant. Your Honor, Carmichael boomed, attempting to reclaim his authoritative baritone. The defense calls Dr. Harrison Caldwell to the stand. Dr. Caldwell was a titan in the world of computer science, a tenured professor at MIT and a frequent consultant for the Department of Defense. He carried himself with the exhausted superiority of a man forced to explain simple arithmetic to toddlers. After establishing his impeccable credentials, Carmichael guided Caldwell to a large digital display board. "Dr. Caldwell," Carmichael began, handing the professor a laser pointer. "You have spent the last 48 hours reviewing the Project Glasshouse source code filed by the plaintiff in 2009, as well as the current active source code for the OmniNeural engine. Are they the same?" Caldwell chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "Absolutely not. Comparing Project Glasshouse to the modern one algorithm is like comparing a wooden wagon wheel to a supersonic jet engine. The 2009 code consists of roughly 12,000 lines of foundational architecture. The one algorithm, which Mr. Harrington patented and developed over the last decade, is a sprawling, elegant ecosystem of over 2 million lines of code. So, Carmichael paced, turning his back to Catherine, even if we accept that Mrs. Harrington wrote this wooden wagon wheel, she had absolutely no part in building the jet engine that OmniCorp sells today." "Correct," Caldwell stated firmly. "The modern engine utilizes deep learning heuristics and dynamic node reallocation that simply did not exist in the 2009 framework. Mr. Plush, Mr. 1. Harrington's subsequent work completely eclipsed the original rudimentary prototype." Carmichael smiled, finally relaxing his shoulders. "Thank you, Doctor. Your witness, Miss Ein Bennett." Olivia Bennett stood slowly. She didn't carry a notepad. She simply walked to the center of the room, her eyes locked on the arrogant professor. "Dr. Caldwell," Olivia said, her voice deceptively mild, "you described the 2009 code as a wooden wagon wheel, a rudimentary prototype." "I did. Are you familiar with the structural integrity of skyscrapers, Doctor?" Caldwell frowned. "I am a computer scientist, not a civil engineer." "But you understand the concept of a foundation," Olivia pressed. "If I build a 100-story skyscraper, the penthouse is magnificent. It has the view, the marble floors, the prestige. But what happens if the concrete foundation poured in the basement is removed?" "The building collapses," Caldwell said, rolling his eyes. "But software is not a building, Miss Bennett." "Isn't it?" Olivia countered sharply. She signaled to her paralegal, who projected a dense wall of code onto the screen behind Caldwell. "Dr. Caldwell, can you identify this specific sequence?" Caldwell squinted at the screen. "That is the core recursive loop of the current algorithm. It handles the dynamic node reallocation I mentioned earlier." "And who wrote it?" "According to the version control logs provided by OmniCorp, Charles Harrington authored that specific module in 2014. Caldwell answered confidently. Olivia pulled a remote from her pocket and clicked it. The screen split in two. On the left was the 2014 code. On the right was a scan of a handwritten notebook page dated August 2008 bearing Catherine's signature. "Dr. Caldwell, would you please read the function written in my client's notebook, penned 6 years before Mr. Harrington supposedly authored, eh?" The color drained from Caldwell's face as he read the handwritten logic. It was identical. Not just similar in function, but identical in its highly idiosyncratic syntax. This is an anomaly," Caldwell stammered. "No, Doctor, it is a foundation," Olivia snapped. No further questions. As Caldwell hurried off the stand, the courtroom buzzed. Carmichael, desperate to regain control, stood up. "Your Honor, the defense recalls Catherine Harrington to the stand. We will put an end to this charade right now." Catherine walked to the witness box with the same unhurried grace she had maintained since day one. "Mrs. Harrington," Carmichael sneered, abandoning all pretense of politeness. "My expert just testified that the modern one algorithm is incredibly complex. Are you truly sitting there asking this court to believe that a woman who has spent the last decade hosting charity galas and picking out curtains, possesses the technical literacy to understand a multi-billion-dollar neural network? I don't just understand it, Mr. Carmichael, Catherine said quietly. I maintained it. Lies. Charles shouted from the defense table, unable to contain himself. Judge Reynolds slammed her gavel, threatening him with contempt. Carmichael, seizing on his client's rage, wheeled a physical whiteboard to the center of the floor. He handed Catherine a dry erase marker. Prove it, Carmichael challenged. If you are the genius behind Omnicorp, explain the 2016 server crisis. The company nearly went bankrupt before the IPO because the engine's predictive modeling began hallucinating data. Charles Harrington worked for 5 days straight to write the patch that saved the company. Show us how he did it. It was a trap. Carmichael knew Catherine hadn't been in the building during the crisis. Catherine took the marker. She stepped down from the witness box and approached the whiteboard. The silence in the room was so profound you could hear the traffic on the street below. She didn't hesitate. She began to write. The crisis in 2016, Catherine spoke calmly as the marker squeaked against the board, was caused because Charles attempted to scale the user base without adjusting the loss function of the neural network. He allowed the model to overfit. She drew the optimization formula with rapid, practiced precision. Mathcal, math toward the ris, that apple afrat, one tus, n, some carb, ibsrum summer, idua, man, left loved, hat heart, rij, log, what that heart, but, one phrase, one, idog, idri, I write pure, lod one quas, one, hat, artia, I, gay right plat, past landokraschen tier the cross intro the crotendet tras endifete pointing to the first half of the equation. But he completely forgot the L2 regularization term, the penalty for complexity. She tapped the lambda theta 222 BLAS portion. Without it, the algorithm memorized the training data instead of learning from it. It hallucinated. She turned to face the courtroom. Charles didn't write the patch, Mr. Patch. Carmichael. Charles panicked. He called me from his office in tears at 2 in the morning. I wrote the patch from our library in the Hamptons, emailed it to his private server, and he pushed it live under his administrative credentials. Carmichael stared at the board, entirely out of his depth. He couldn't read the math, but he could read the horrified expression on Charles' face. You have no proof of that, Carmichael deflected weakly. A wife claiming she gave her husband advice over the phone is not proof of authorship. Not. Sorry. I don't need phone records, Catherine said, her voice turning to ice, because I left a digital signature inside the patch. If you open the source code, line 42089, you will find an inactive string of binary. When translated, it reads, Property of C. Emeshol Maijwalanrao. God save the king, for he cannot save himself. A collective gasp swept through the press gallery. Catherine placed the cap back on the marker with a sharp click. I am not asking for half of Omnicorp, Mr. Marthy. Carmichael, I am asking for my company back. By Wednesday morning, the atmosphere in courtroom 3B had transitioned from a legal proceeding to a corporate execution. The mahogany benches of the gallery, previously occupied by board clerks and journalists, were now flanked by high-powered executives. William Forrester, the chairman of Omnicorp's board of directors, sat in the front row. His face was a mask of furious, unblinking terror. The revelation of the binary watermark had triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. Omnicorp's internal auditors, spurred by the subpoena Olivia had filed the previous night, had accessed the archived 2016 source code. The watermark was there, exactly where Catherine said it would be. Carmichael, realizing his technical defense was obliterated, pivoted to a desperate legal strategy, statute of limitations, and abandonment. He needed to prove that even if Catherine had created the code, she had willingly surrendered it to Charles, allowing him to commercialize it while she reaped the financial benefits of his labor. To do this, he had to put Charles Harrington on the stand. Charles walked the witness box, his Bryony suit suddenly looking a size too large. The bravado was entirely stripped away, leaving a desperate, cornered man. Charles Carmichael began, his tone soothing, attempting to humanize his client. Let's address the elephant in the room. Did your wife assist you with the coding in the early days of Omnicorp? Yes, Charles said, his voice raspy. He looked at the jury box, playing the part of the wounded partner. Catherine is brilliant. I've never denied that. We were a team, but building a company is more than writing an algorithm. It's securing venture capital. It's hiring thousands of employees. It's scaling infrastructure, fighting off corporate espionage, and taking a company public. I did all of that. She chose to step away. She chose to let me lead. And did she ever formally claim ownership of Omnicorp's intellectual property during your 15-year marriage? Never, never, Charles stated firmly. She enjoyed the billions of dollars I generated. She lived a life of unimaginable luxury. Only now, when our marriage has sadly broken down, is she retroactively trying to steal the credit for my life's work. Carmichael turned to Olivia, a smug, albeit fragile, smile returning to his face. Your witness. Olivia Bennett approached the podium slowly, carrying a thick binder. She did not look at Charles. She looked directly at William Forrester in the gallery, making sure the chairman of the board was paying close attention. Mr. Harrington, Olivia began, you claim you built the infrastructure. You claim you paid the bills and secured the capital to keep Omnicorp afloat in its early days, while your wife simply enjoyed the luxury. That is correct. Olivia opened her binder. Plaintiff's Exhibit 88, Your Honor. Copies of bank statements from the Catherine Montgomery Irrevocable Trust, a fund established by my client's late grandfather. She projected the statements onto the screens. Mr. Harrington, can you read the highlighted transactions from January 2010 to December 2012? Charles swallowed hard. They are wire transfers. To whom? Aren't old Chum, look odd. A retort to Amazon Web Services and to Equinix data centers. For what purpose? Olivia demanded, her voice rising. Charles remained silent, his eyes darting toward Carmichael, who was furiously writing notes. I will answer for you, Mr. Harrington, Olivia said. Those transfers totaling nearly $2 million of Catherine's personal, premarital money paid for the server space that hosted the Omni neural engine. While you were allegedly building the company, Omnicorp had exactly $0 in revenue. Your venture capital didn't arrive until late 2010. For 2 years, Catherine Harrington single-handedly bankrolled the survival of your prototype. The chairman of the board leaned forward, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. The narrative of the self-made tech god was disintegrating before his eyes. It was a marital loan, Charles deflected, his voice shaking. I paid her back. Did you? Olivia asked, flipping to a new page. Let's talk about how you paid her back. Let's talk about the 2011 prenuptial agreement. Objection, Carmichael interrupted. The prenup has already been established as legally binding regarding the separation of marital assets. I am not questioning its validity regarding marital assets, Your Honor, Olivia countered. I am questioning the circumstances under which it was signed, which goes directly to the defense's claim that Catherine willingly surrendered her intellectual property. Overruled. Proceed, Ms. Bennett. Olivia stepped out from behind the podium, walking directly toward Charles. Mr. Harrington, where was Catherine on May 14, 2011, the day she signed that prenuptial agreement? Charles gripped the railing of the witness box. She was in New York. Be specific. Where in New York? Silence stretched across the room, heavy and suffocating. She was at New York Presbyterian Hospital, wasn't she? Olivia stated, her tone laced with absolute disgust. Plaintiff's Exhibit 92, Your Honor. Medical records confirming that on May 13, 2011, Catherine Harrington suffered a ruptured ectopic pregnancy. She required emergency surgery and nearly bled to death. A murmur of horror rippled through the gallery. Catherine sat at the plaintiff's table, her eyes lowered, her hands folded tightly in her lap. On May 14, Olivia continued relentlessly. While she was heavily medicated on morphine, recovering in the ICU, grieving the loss of a child, you brought Thomas Carmichael and a notary into her hospital room. You handed her a 40-page document and told her it was just some standard insurance paperwork required to cover the surgery. Objection. Speculation. Carmichael roared, leaping to his feet, his face pale. It is not speculation if I have the hospital visitor logs and the notary's own deposition admitting they did not read the contents of the document aloud due to the patient's medicated state. Olivia fired back, slamming a document onto the judge's bench. Judge Reynolds read the paper, her jaw tightening. She glared at Carmichael with a look that could have stripped paint from the walls. "Sit down, Mr. Carmichael, before I hold you in contempt." Carmichael slowly sank into his chair, effectively neutralized. "You didn't just trick her into signing away her rights to marital property," Olivia said, turning her wrath back onto Charles. Buried on page 38 of that insurance paperwork was a blanket IP transfer, assigning all rights from Project Glasshouse to Omnicorp Solutions. You stole it from her while she was bleeding in a hospital bed. Charles was trembling now. She knew what she was signing. She wanted me to have it. If she wanted you to have it, Charles, then why did you spend the next 10 years trying to crack the Genesis key? The phrase hit the courtroom like a physical shockwave. Charles flinched, physically recoiling as if he had been struck. "What is a Genesis key, Mr. Harrington?" Olivia asked softly. "I don't know what you're talking about," Charles lied, though his hyperventilating chest betrayed him. "Let me remind you," Olivia said. "When Catherine wrote the foundational architecture in 2009, she built an administrative fail-safe, a root-level encryption protocol that locks the deepest layers of the neural network's machine learning capabilities. Without the Genesis key, a master password, no one can alter the core behavioral algorithms. Not you. Not your engineers. Omnicorp has been building patches on top of a locked box for a decade, because you couldn't get inside." Olivia turned to Judge Reynolds. "Your Honor, yesterday, we secured a court order demanding Omnicorp provide a live terminal connected to the Omni Neural Engine root directory." The courtroom doors opened and 2 court bailiffs wheeled in a secure servo cart topped with a single glowing monitor and a keyboard. "Mr. Harrington," Olivia said, gesturing to the terminal, "you have sworn under oath that you are the sole creator and master architect of the one algorithm. If that is true, log in." Charles stared at the blinking cursor on the black screen. The prompt read, "Enter root Ekonskern, Behaftigten, Frost." He stood frozen in the witness box. The silence was agonizing. 30 seconds passed, a minute. The chairman of the board put his head in his hands. I don't remember it," Charles whispered. "It's an old password." Olivia turned to Catherine. Catherine stood up, her posture perfect, her navy blue dress immaculate. She walked calmly past the defense table, ignoring Charles entirely, and approached the terminal. She didn't look at the keys as she typed. Her fingers flew across the board with practiced grace. She typed, "Icarus flew to Sklosh, but dustas. But I dustas, the wheel was 1.5.44. She hit enter. The screen flashed green. Lines of core directory code cascaded down the monitor, granting absolute unfettered access to the $4 billion empire. Catherine turned to face Charles, her voice ringing clear and authoritative through the stunned courtroom. "You are locked out, Charles," she said simply. "Of the company, of the code, and of my life." Charles Harrington collapsed back into the witness chair, burying his face in his hands as the gavel fell, signaling the end of an era and the rebirth of an architect. For 10 agonizing seconds, the only sound in courtroom 3B was the rhythmic hum of the server cart's cooling fans. The cascading green text on the monitor reflected in Charles Harrington's wide, terrified eyes. He had spent 10 years selling the world a myth, constructing a fortress of billions on a foundation of lies. In one keystroke, his quiet, compliant wife had triggered the demolition charges. Judge Patricia Reynolds was the first to break the paralysis. Her gavel struck the block with the finality of a gunshot. "Court is in recess until tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, she announced, her voice echoing over the sudden, explosive roar of the gallery. "Bailiffs, secure that terminal. No one touches it." Pandemonium ensued. Financial journalists practically trampled each other in a frantic sprint toward the heavy oak doors, shouting into their cell phones. In the front row of the gallery, William Forrester, chairman of the Omnicorp board, stood up slowly. His face was devoid of color. He did not look at Charles. He did not ask Carmichael for an explanation. Forrester simply turned on his heel and walked out, his retinue of corporate attorneys trailing closely behind him like pallbearers. Charles remained paralyzed in the witness box. Thomas Carmichael, his silk tie now hopelessly stained with nervous sweat, had to physically pull his client by the arm to drag him toward the defense chambers. Across the aisle, Catherine Harrington sat quietly, smoothing a microscopic wrinkle from her navy blue dress. Olivia Bennet placed a protective hand on her client's shoulder. There was no celebration, no gloating. The battle had turned, but Olivia knew wounded animals were the most dangerous. By dawn the following day, the financial world had effectively imploded. The SEC extended the trading halt on Omnicorp indefinitely. Business networks ran round-the-clock coverage displaying the leaked transcript of the Genesis key moment. The narrative of the brilliant, self-made tech god had evaporated overnight, replaced by a much more compelling story: the invisible architect who had finally stepped out of the shadows. When court resumed, the atmosphere was thick, toxic, and dangerously unpredictable. Carmichael looked haggard. He had spent the entire night fighting off frantic calls from the Omnicorp board, who were now openly discussing Charles' immediate termination. Carmichael had exactly one bullet left in his chamber. It was a scorched earth tactic, a desperate maneuver designed to ensure mutual destruction. "Your Honor," Carmichael rasped, rising heavily from his chair, "the defense acknowledges the unexpected demonstration regarding the encryption key. However, ownership of an asset is inextricably linked to the liability of that asset. If Mrs. Harrington insists she is the sole owner and active maintainer of the Omni-Neural engine, she cannot selectively claim the profits while ignoring the poison." Judge Reynolds narrowed her eyes. "Get to the point, Mr. Carmichael." The defense calls Gregory Hayes to the stand. A tall, nervously sweating man in a rumpled suit walked down the aisle. Gregory Hayes was Omnicorp's chief technology officer, a man who had historically acted as Charles' loyal shadow. He took the oath with a trembling hand. "Mr. Hayes," Carmichael began, pacing the floor like a caged wolf, "you are familiar with the deepest architecture of the One algorithm, correct?" "There's two words. As familiar as anyone can be without the root key, yes," Hayes replied, his voice cracking slightly. "Can you tell this court about a proprietary module implemented in 2018, internally designated as Project Cerberus?" At the plaintiff's table, Olivia stiffened. She leaned closer to Catherine, whispering urgently. But Catherine's face remained an unreadable mask of calm. Hayes swallowed hard, looking pleadingly at the judge before answering. "Project Cerberus is a predictive data scraping module. It was integrated into the One algorithm to process vast amounts of unstructured metadata." "Metadata from where, Mr. Hayes?" Carmichael demanded. "From Vol." Everywhere. Social media feeds, private cloud storage hubs, encrypted communication networks. It bypasses standard API restrictions to build complete predictive psychological profiles of users without their consent. A collective gasp swept through the press pool. This wasn't just a corporate divorce anymore, this was a confession to the largest illegal data mining operation in domestic history. And who authorized the deployment of Project Cerberus? Carmichael asked, his voice ringing with desperate triumph. Mr. Harrington negotiated the contract, Hayes testified, staring at his shoes. He sold the Cerberus backdoor to a private intelligence contractor in Washington. It generates roughly $800 million in off-the-books revenue annually. Carmichael turned to face the judge, spreading his arms wide. There you have it, Your Honor. The one algorithm is heavily compromised. It contains an illegal, highly classified espionage tool. Charles Harrington accepts his responsibility in this matter. He is prepared to face the regulatory consequences. Carmichael then pointed a trembling finger directly at Catherine. But if Catherine Harrington claims she is the sole architect and active maintainer of this code, if she claims she had root access while my client did not, then she is legally culpable for the creation and deployment of Project Cerberus. She is claiming ownership of an illegal weapon. If she takes Omnicorp, she takes the federal indictments that come with it. The courtroom erupted into total chaos. Reporters shouted over one another. Judge Reynolds pounded her gavel relentlessly, her face flushed with fury. Order. I will clear this room. Charles sat at the defense table, a twisted, bitter smile finally breaking through his terrified facade. It was the ultimate poison pill. He had built a bomb into the company's basement. If Catherine took the throne, she would detonate it, destroying herself and facing decades in federal prison. Do you see, Your Honor? Carmichael shouted over the din. She cannot have it both ways. She is either an ignorant wife who deserves a small settlement, or she is a cybercriminal. Judge Reynolds glared at the defense attorney. Mr. Carmichael, you have just implicated your own client in a massive federal crime. My client is fully aware of the consequences, Your Honor, Carmichael stated boldly. He is willing to take the fall. The question is Mrs. Harrington willing to go to federal prison just to spite him? The trap was sprung. The tension in the room was so thick it was suffocating. Everyone turned to look at the elegant woman in the navy blue dress, expecting to see her crack, expecting the tears, expecting the terrified surrender. Instead, Catherine Harrington smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that did not reach her eyes. Olivia Bennett stood up, completely unruffled by the bomb Carmichael had just detonated. She calmly adjusted her glasses. Your Honor, Olivia said, her voice cutting through the remaining murmurs like a scalpel. The plaintiff requests permission to recall Mrs. Harrington to the stand. We have some clarification regarding Project Cerberus. Nah. Hold. Catherine walked to the witness box with the same measured, aristocratic grace she had displayed on the first day of the trial. She did not look at Charles. She did not look at the frantic journalists. She looked only at Olivia. Mrs. Harrington, Olivia began, leaning casually against the podium. You heard the testimony of Gregory Hayes. Are you familiar with Project Cerberus? Intimately, Catherine replied softly. Carmichael shot a triumphant look at Charles. The confession was on the record. When did you first discover that your husband had integrated this illegal data scraping module into your algorithm? Olivia asked. In November of 2018, Catherine answered. I was conducting routine maintenance on the deep learning heuristics from our estate in Aspen. I noticed a massive, unauthorized data stream siphoning processing power from the core engine. I traced the stream and found Cerberus. And what did Cerberus do exactly? It was designed to be a parasite, Catherine explained, her tone shifting into the clinical detachment of a master engineer. It was meant to piggyback on the algorithm's predictive routing, silently copying user data and transmitting it to an external server cluster in Virginia, owned by the private intelligence firm Mr. Bullier. Hayes mentioned. Did you confront Charles about this? I did, Catherine said, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, carrying a chilling weight. He told me it was a necessary evil. He said the intelligence firm had threatened to lobby the FTC to block our upcoming acquisitions if we didn't cooperate. He told me he had no choice. So, you knew about the illegal data harvesting, Carmichael shouted from his table, unable to wait for his turn. You admit it. Judge Reynolds slammed her gavel. One more outburst, Mr. Carmichael, and you will spend the night in a holding cell. Olivia waited for absolute silence before continuing. Mrs. Harrington, what did you do after you discovered Project Cerberus? Catherine shifted her gaze, finally locking eyes with her husband. The bitter smile vanished from Charles's face, replaced by a sudden creeping dread. He knew his wife. He knew that look. I am an architect, Miss Bennet, Catherine said smoothly. When I find a parasite in my house, I don't burn the house down. I build a quarantine. Olivia turned toward the heavy server cart still sitting in the center of the courtroom. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like my client to demonstrate exactly what she did to Project Cerberus. Proceed, Judge Reynolds commanded, leaning so far over her bench she was nearly standing. Catherine stepped down from the witness box and approached the terminal. The screen was still unlocked, glowing with the green text of the root directory. She typed a rapid sequence of commands. A new window opened, displaying a complex web of data nodes. This is the live feed of Project Cerberus, Catherine narrated, pointing to a thick red line pulsating on the screen. This is the data stream leaving Omnicorp servers and traveling to the intelligence firm in Virginia. So the espionage tool is active. Olivia asked. The tool is active, Catherine agreed. But the data is not. She typed another command, expanding the red line to reveal the raw code streaming through it. When I discovered Cerberus, I could not simply delete it, Catherine explained. Charles had hard-coded the transmission triggers into the user interface layer. If I deleted the module, the entire Omnicorp platform would crash. So, instead of deleting it, I used the Genesis key to silently sever Cerberus from the actual user database. Carmichael frowned in deep confusion. If it's severed, what is it transmitting? Not us. Oaked. Catherine looked at the defense attorney with a look of profound pity. A generative adversarial network. A hallucination engine. I built a secondary closed-loop AI and fed it into Cerberus. For the last 3 years, the algorithm hasn't been sending stolen private data to Washington. It has been sending artificially generated noise. Fake names, fake browsing histories, fake behavioral profiles. The courtroom was utterly paralyzed. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. You, what? Charles stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper. A son botched your treason, Charles, Catherine said, turning to face him fully. The 3 years your private intelligence firm has been paying you $800 million a year for an absolute lie. They are making geopolitical security models based on data generated by a glorified random number generator. I didn't commit espionage, I committed containment. Olivia walked to the center of the room. Mrs. Harrington, can you prove this? Line A12 of the Cerberus subroutine, Catherine said, stepping back from the monitor. I left my signature again. Olivia nodded to the court's independent tech expert, who hurried to the terminal. He typed furiously, verifying the code. After a minute, he looked up at Judge Reynolds, his face pale. She's telling the truth, Your Honor, the expert confirmed, his voice shaking. The module is entirely walled off from user data. It's transmitting highly sophisticated artificially generated dummy data, and the encrypted signature matches. No. Olivia turned to Judge Reynolds. Your Honor, Catherine Harrington did not engage in illegal data harvesting. She prevented it, Charles Harrington, however, has just confessed in open court to corporate espionage, gross violation of user privacy, and defrauding a federal intelligence contractor of hundreds of millions of dollars. The FBI field office in Manhattan has been monitoring this broadcast. I imagine they are pulling up to the courthouse as we speak. Charles Harrington looked as though he had been physically struck by a train. He collapsed over the defense table, gasping for air, clutching at his chest. Carmichael backed away from him, realizing his career was effectively over for facilitating a confession to federal fraud. Judge Patricia Reynolds took off her reading glasses. She looked at the broken man at the defense table, and then at the woman standing tall by the server cart. This court finds the 2011 prenuptial agreement void due to fraudulent inducement and extreme duress, Judge Reynolds declared, her voice ringing with historical finality. Furthermore, based on irrefutable cryptographic evidence, this court recognizes Catherine Harrington as the sole architect, author, and rightful owner of the OmniNeural engine, and by extension, the controlling intellectual property of OmniCorp Solutions. The gavel slammed down. It sounded like a thunderclap. Mr. Harrington, Judge Reynolds added, looking at the door at the back of the courtroom, where two men in dark windbreakers had just entered. I suggest you retain a good criminal defense attorney. You are dismissed. Catherine did not stay to watch Charles be led away in handcuffs. She gathered her purse and her single faded manila envelope. She walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, the sea of journalists, parting for her in stunned, reverent silence. She walked out into the blinding flashbulbs of Center Street, no longer just a wife, but the absolute sovereign of a $4 billion empire she had built from the shadows. Catherine's triumph reminds us that true genius doesn't always roar from a podium. Sometimes it quietly writes the code that changes the world, while everyone else is busy taking the credit. The facade of power is fragile, but the foundation of undeniable talent is bulletproof. When cornered, the most brilliant minds don't just fight back, they rewrite the rules of the game entirely. If this story of ultimate revenge, hidden genius, and courtroom justice kept you on the edge of your seat, we want to hear your thoughts. What was the most shocking twist for you? Drop a comment below and let us know. Don't forget to hit that like button to support the channel. Share this incredible story with your friends who love the brilliant plot twist. And subscribe with notifications turned on so you never miss out on our next thrilling deep dive into real-life drama.